Hey, good morning, everyone in the history of the Constitution class. Usually I wear a suit when I'm in court, but today I have a day off from that usual sort of progression, and I decided to wear a shirt that was in the laundry that just came out clean. This is my vote corpsman, and we are in the election cycle right now as we speak. I'm not running for anything right now, but I am a political junkie and involved in politics, and this class really excites me because there are huge ramifications in our election process that impact the Constitution. And people are sometimes surprised by that because, well, the Constitution is a sort of a fixed document based upon original intent. Well, it is, but what that original intent is subject to interpretation. Well, the president and the Congress doesn't do that. The judiciary does. And we know that from Marbury versus Madison, the most important case that ever came out of the Supreme Court, that it's the court that ultimately decides what the Constitution means. But you have to remember that the president of the United States picks the members of the court when there's a vacancy. And the Senate, the upper house of our Congress, confirms those appointments or rejects them. And so voting is a very important process. And a lot of people say, well, the judiciary is kind of immune from the political theater because they're appointments for life and they don't bow to political pressure. But they are part of the political process because the president does, in fact, select them and the Senate approves them. And what they do to interpret the Constitution is significant because there's really no way we can override what the Supreme Court determines our Constitution means unless we amend the Constitution, or over time, maybe we get different justices on there, or we get the current justices to somehow either narrow or overrule their previous decision. When they do that, it's very rare to do it in their own time. It usually takes decades, if not multiple decades, before the court moves away from a legal precedent once it's established. So just wanted that way as a little introduction why I'm wearing what appears to be a t-shirt because of my laundry woes today. But we're going into Jacksonian America a little bit here, and most people are interested in the Constitution. I don't care about Andrew Jackson, what his political opinions were, but they do have a huge impact on the court. We know John Marshall, the Supreme Court justice, and the people that follow him, like Joseph Story, another Supreme Court member right here from Massachusetts. They had a nationalistic view of the nature of political power, meaning that the federal government is supreme, and many of the powers that are listed in the Constitution are actually more expansive than they seem because of the necessary and proper clause. Now we have Andrew Jackson, who's much more of a states' rights character, and he's going to be appointing justices. One of his name's Roger Taney. Some people pronounce it Taney, but it's actually Roger Taney. The reason I know, I read a lot of books about him. And he is going to shape the court in a different direction than John Marshall does over time. John Marshall dies in the middle of the 1830s, and states' rights becomes much more paramount. In fact, we go into the Civil War not too long in 1860, but it's brewing during this period of time. Andrew Jackson's a real interesting character. I'm always surprised that more students don't do biographies when they pick their course topic for their research, because Andrew Jackson's a really complicated, interesting guy. There are times when I hear his philosophy and his actions, and I say, here's my guy that I want to sort of attach my wagon to in terms of philosophy, in terms of outlook. And there's other times I say, this guy's the most despicable president we've ever had. So he is a very complex, mixed character in history. But what do we really want to know out of it? He is going to start a very democratizing period of time in American history. What do I mean by democratizing? For white men, the power to vote and participate in civic life is going to expand dramatically. He runs in 1824 as the hero of the War of 1812, the battle down in Louisiana in 1814 into 1815. He comes out a war hero. He has national prominence now. He runs for president. He wins the popular vote, but he doesn't win enough of the Electoral College. The person that comes in second place is John Quincy Adams, and another guy, Henry Clay, gets a significant amount of votes. Now the election has to go to the House of Representatives based upon the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And so Clay and John Quincy Adams come up with a deal, and it really bitters Andrew Jackson. It's 1824, and he called it, I believe it's the corrupt bargain in that election. I love the term. And it's a corrupt bargain of 1824. John Quincy Adams, it gets stymied on much of his plan. He's a nationalist, John Quincy Adams. He wants to create an infrastructure of roads and of national banks and things of that nature. He's sort of a federalist in a way. In that view, they really become a nationalist now. That's what the Federalists probably should have been called. But he doesn't get a lot of his visions passed. And Andrew Jackson's stewing during this period because he feels like he'd been denied the presidency by this corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. But he does get it in 1828. And in 1828, he has a whole new view of how democracy should play out. He believes in egalitarianism, equality for white men. And make this distinction significant. He's a slave owner. He's a racist, like many of the people of that era were. He doesn't believe in women's rights in terms of participating in democratic processes and civic life. He does believe they play a very important role in society, but not the way men should. But the property requirement, remember in our early American history, you had to own property in order to participate in civic life. You had to own property and have a stake in society to vote or run for office. This ends during Jackson's period of time, and this is when the party becomes known as the Democratic Party. He believes he's sort of the heir apparent to Thomas Jefferson's view. Small federal government, states' rights are much more paramount, and the federal government really has a much more limited role. However, he often gets confused with the state rights allegiances of people like John C. Calhoun that think the states have the power to nullify federal law if they don't agree or to secede from the country if the state's interest somehow departs too drastically from what the state views its interests, goals, and philosophy. Very fascinating. So when he does see the federal government having a role, the federal government is supreme and it's omnipotent. But he thinks it's a very narrow view. He also doesn't believe in things like experts. He doesn't like people with titles. He doesn't think people should be in political office for a career. No one should be in career political office. He doesn't think you should have necessarily any special skills and knowledge. Now, we kind of laugh at that today, that you don't want people to be not necessarily educated to be in political office and running our country and our communities. But you have to remember, back in 1828, the government was more simplified. In his view, was extremely popular. In fact, when he won the presidency, everyday common people stormed into Washington, D.C. to celebrate his inauguration, and they were covered in boots with mud and all kinds of riffraff, or what one might think of as riffraff, were welcomed into the White House to celebrate his presidency. And one thing, he was extremely politically astute, whether you like him or not. He believed in what we call the patronizing system, where basically, if you support him, you're going to get an appointment to office, and therefore strengthening his political control of the government. That's alive and well today. It's called the spoils system, winner take all. And the president appoints most federal offices, and you serve at the president's discretion. And that becomes controversial even today. President Trump's going to fire somebody, or President Obama, when they fire someone, people say, "Oh, that's outrageous. They were doing a good job. The president shouldn't be able to do that." Yeah, they should. It's in the Constitution. They're the chief executive. It's kind of like they're the boss. And so if you're the boss, you serve in most offices on the federal government at the will of the president. So when the president comes in, there's usually a sweep of the offices, and they put a loyalist in. It's common sense. I think any president would do it. I know I would do it. Although I'd like to keep competent people on that were more, I call technocrats. They're just doing a good job, and they don't really have a political agenda. But Andrew Jackson created what we call the spoils system, which was much more popular during his era as president. But what do we care about the constitutional? It's the view of the Constitution being much more narrowly applied. The federal government doesn't have all these sweeping powers under the necessary and proper clause. He hated John Marshall. He thought John Marshall brought way too much power to the court. He thought, hey, I'm swearing to uphold the Constitution. I am the executive of this country. I'm the president. Why should the court have any more authority than I do in interpreting the Constitution? Or why should the legislature have any less power than the judiciary? Nowhere in it does it say it shall be, presumptively able to strike down acts of a president or acts of the legislature. So it brings a tension with the court, and there's no question about it. And this is one case I want you to know for the exam. The state of Georgia is trying to basically swindle and push out the Cherokee Nation, which had a large tract of land and a treaty where they could live. Well, the land suddenly becomes attractive to Georgians, white Georgians. They want to take the land. And the Cherokees take legal process. They don't say, we're going to fight and create another war. We're going to take it to court. In the first case, the Supreme Court kind of punts on and say, well, we really don't have jurisdiction because we're an appeals court and you started here, we lack jurisdiction, so they punted on it. But the second case comes down in 1832, and John Marshall's still in the court. He dies a few years later, but he's on the court, and the case is called Worcester v. Virginia. And I'll put up a little video from YouTube describing what it said. But in a nutshell, John Marshall says the Cherokee Nation's correct. They are sovereign within the state of Georgia. They own that land. They can govern themselves in that area. And the state of Georgia doesn't have the power to expel the Native Americans. And what happens next? No federal marshals come to the aid of the decision. They don't enforce it. They basically ignore the Supreme Court. And Andrew Jackson's on board with that ignoring of the decision. In fact, there's a famous quote, whether it's true or not, I don't know if it's just folklore, but Andrew Jackson said something to the effect, well, John Marshall's made his decision. Let's see him enforce it. And this is probably one of the few times in American history, from the Marbury versus Madison to today, that a Supreme Court has made a decision in the federal government, in terms of the executive, that the Congress, that the people just simply refuse to follow. It's really shocking if you think about it. And the Supreme Court saved grace on another case, made it kind of sound like they renegotiated and the Cherokee Nation agreed, so it's not an issue anymore. They basically got pushed out through threats of violence, and that's the famous, I believe it's the 1,000-mile tiers, where they had to go west of the Cherokee Nation had to move west of the Mississippi River, and thousands of them died during that basically forced march to a new poor lands that they didn't want to go to. It's a real tragedy in the sense that Andrew Jackson was always a Native American fighter, for lack of it, and that's part of his military history as well. But he certainly didn't stand up for the rule of law, because the court said that the Cherokee Nation had a right to maintain that property. And the court was simply ignored. One of the few times in history. I don't think it'll ever happen again, to be quite frankly. And those of you that are watching the Barrett confirmation, this is, I think her first name's Amy Barrett's a new Supreme Court member. Trump nominated her. She went through the process. The Senate approved her, very close. But she talked about things like super precedents, meaning that the court has established certain principles that the nation stands by and probably will never be able to move away from. And one of them is Marbury versus Madison, that when the Supreme Court determines what the Constitution means, we live with it as a nation. And I think that's a healthy part of the checks and balances system we have. But boy, there was a glitch right there during Jacksonian period of time. And it's going to be in a few years when John Marshall dies, and he's going to appoint someone that has the same mental mindset as he does on how the court should interpret the Constitution, and that's Roger Taney. So you should know that famous case, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, really a sad period. But now comes up Andrew during John Quincy Adams' period as president. They passed something called the Tariff Bill. Basically, the South called it, what do they call it specifically? The Tariff of Abominations. And it was really killing South Carolina exports. And they said, you know what? We don't like it. We're dissatisfied with it. And John C. Calhoun's the vice president of the United States. He's a states' rights guy. So is Andrew Jackson, right? So they're on board with each other. Not so much. John C. Calhoun actually takes the position that states, just like and it will be on the test, and definitely in the final, if not this next exam, the Virginia and Kentucky resolves. Remember those, when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were so upset over the Alien and Sedition Law that they said the states had the ability to nullify and basically ignore federal law that conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution, because the states are basically joining the Union voluntarily. They have a right to basically reject federal standards if it conflicts with their view of the Constitution or their state's interests. Now it comes up again. It's in 1832. This tariff bill is killing South Carolina. John C. Calhoun's from South Carolina. He's the vice president of the United States. Actually leaves the vice presidency over this issue. And basically he says South Carolina is going to succeed. We're going to leave. And we're going to do away with it. And Andrew Jackson, a lot of people thought Andrew Jackson would be on board and say, they're absolutely right to do that. No. He said the federal government does have the power to pass this tariff because it's clearly in the Constitution. What do we know about Andrew Jackson? If the federal government does have the power, and it's clear, it's not this necessary and proper aspect of the language, tariffs are clearly in the power of the federal government. He says, you must abide. And if you don't abide, I am going to send federal troops down there. And what does South Carolina do? They start mustering their militia. They're getting ready to succeed from this country. So the Civil War was brewing much earlier over states' rights, and it wasn't initially over slavery, although slavery is definitely going to be the vehicle later. It's not yet. It's over this kind of concept of who's preeminent. Is it going to be the state governments or the federal governments? And is it basically several sovereign states that had agreed to be part of a compact that they can break away from just as if they had entered? Or is it one nation where states have some control over what we call police powers that really impact their localities internally? And that's the tension we have during this era. It gets, in fact, I don't think it's in this material that I'm reading through, but there was a famous scene where both of John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson was over at some, they were giving a toast, and John C. Calhoun basically gave a toast to states' rights and freedom and not being under the thumb of basically national providence of the federal government. And then Andrew Jackson got up and basically one-upped them by saying, yes, states' rights over everything else except for the nation of the United States of America, which got a bigger roar. And that's what really separated these two men throughout history. And John C. Calhoun will be alive right at the eve of the Civil War. Basically, South Carolina is the first state to succeed. Later, we know that. So the nullification crisis, and that's what it's all about. And it's the South Carolina Exposition that Calhoun wrote that the states have a power to basically nullify federal law if it conflicts with their interpretation, if they find it too burdensome, and they have the power to succeed. And that's what they were about to do. Andrew Jackson, because of his view of everyday people can be involved in government, that you don't have to have degrees and be considered an expert in something or be titled or become from a rich family. He rejected that, and so did the American people, and became very, very popular. And that party now becomes known as the Democrats. They were the Democrat Republicans before under Thomas Jefferson, but they move away from some of the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson, and they create this bigger, broad-based party that we call the Democrats. And who was attracted to it? Well, the poor were, and therefore recent immigrants. And to this day, a lot of the Democratic Party is made up of working class people, are a core component of the Democratic Party, and so are recent immigrants because of the history during this period of time. And so the party that was in opposition to him were the Whigs, but they're really falling apart. And the reason why they call themselves the Whigs, in case you're ever curious about it, I always thought it was a terrible name for a political party. The Whigs were basically taking their name from a British group of politicians who were anti-monarchy, and so they basically mocked the aristocracy and the monarchy by calling themselves Whigs, to be in opposition of the basically the omnipotent power of the president or the king. And so they just adopted the name. I still think it's a terrible name for the opposition party. And that's the thing the Whigs stood for. So when you say, what do the Democrats stand for? They stand for states' rights. They stand for small federal government. They stand for very egalitarian views for white men. So when you say egalitarian, then say for only white men. It sounds like an oxymoron. But that's what they really believed in. And then you say, what do the Whigs believe in? Because anything that was in opposition to Andrew Jackson, because he was so powerful as president. And I don't know if it's in this class or another class, I know one student's doing the power of the presidency being the most powerful branch of government. It's the argument or the thesis. And one could say that there are different times where the presidency becomes very powerful. And one of them is during the two terms of Andrew Jackson. There's no question about it. In fact, what does he do to the national bank? He doesn't think government should be involved in banking, not the federal government. The state should be. So when the charter came up for renewal, the Congress passed it, and Andrew Jackson vetoed it. And he actually removed 3 years prior to basically vetoing the second national bank. He removed all the federal funds out of it and put it in state banks. Really, he likes small government. Very interesting guy. But so what happens to this, the nullification crisis on the South Carolina, they're ready to go to war. And basically, they avert it by reducing the tariff, and everyone backs down. And there was an act called the Force Act that Jackson got passed as well to give him federal troops and federal authority to go into South Carolina and basically seize control. And we know what happened was a stitch in time saved nine. Basically, they came to a compromise, and they avoided the Civil War for another 28 years. So Jackson and the presidency, some famous cases that come in there. Now this is where, again, they don't like to have the court under Roger Taney. John Marshall's dead now. they believe that the states have a lot of police power. The states can do pretty much whatever they need to do to govern the welfare and the benefit of their society. And they do that over vested private property rights that John Marshall used to basically champion so much previously. In one of the famous cases is Barron v. Baltimore. I might put a little something, it might be a test question about it, but basically that the state had police power that lay beyond federal intervention. This guy basically had a wharf or a harbor, and the federal government or the state of Maryland was doing this. It was actually Baltimore. The city of Baltimore was doing this, creating its own harbor, and it was damaging his property. And he sued under the Fifth Amendment, saying, the taking of my property is eminent domain, and basically by ruining my harbor section, you're basically taking my property. And the Supreme Court under Roger Taney says, no, this is for the public benefit of the basically state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore, and your property hasn't been taken. You still have it. It's useless now, but you still have it. That might be decided a little bit differently today, but it's real interesting how they defer to states doing what they want to do internally under this court now. And here's one of the biggest cases that comes out. What happens in Barron is they not only argue that the states had the power to do it, but they also said the Fifth Amendment wasn't applicable to state action. This is shocking to most of you to hear. We're going to get into it soon. I hope to segue into some Bill of Rights stuff very soon. But a lot of people are surprised by the fact that the Bill of Rights were only applicable to federal action. In this case, confirmed it, and that's Baltimore v. Barron, or Barron v. Baltimore. And it basically said that the due process clause and the taking clause of the Fifth Amendment, that you can't take my property without due process of law and just compensation, only applied to federal government being involved. And this is the city of Baltimore or the state of Maryland. So it was totally inapplicable. This is a very, very important concept. All of the justices agreed, all 9 of them at the time, that the whole Bill of Rights only applied to federal action. I'll reaffirm that later when we get into the Bill of Rights, talking specifically. One of my favorite cases came right out of Massachusetts, Charles River Bridge case. This guy had a bridge. It was a private bridge. He was making a fortune. His family was making a fortune, charging fees to go over the Charles River Bridge. And a lot of people saying, this is a monopoly, and we don't like monopolies. Let's let the government make a bridge with private interests, and the private interests will have a charter for a period of time. And once they make a profit to a certain degree, then it will be free for all to go over. Well, the guy that owns the Charles River Bridge is going, wait a minute, you gave me a charter to have this bridge, and basically by creating your own municipal bridge, at some point you're going to undercut me because everyone's going to go over the bridge once it becomes free. And he thought he was going to win based upon previous decisions of John Marshall's court, saying that once the government or any individual has a vested contract right, the government can't interfere with it unless they compensate him in some way. But here, the Taney court says that when it comes to government doing something for the social benefit of all, unless the clear language of the contract said it will be exclusive and that no other grants of use or authority could coexist with them, the community has the ability to do what best serves the public welfare of their citizenry. And basically, that really killed that guy's monopoly. But it's right here in Massachusetts, famous case. I'll probably put something up on that. Contract clause, Charles River Bridge. There's a few other cases. The Prigg case versus Pennsylvania. This is the acceptance of this dual sovereignty. States have, and what the principle of dual sovereignty is when we get to the test questions, is that the states are supreme and omnipotent on state law questions, and the federal government is supreme and omnipotent on their federal questions. It'll be the Supreme Court's role to determine whether it's really a state question or a federal question. But if it's a state question, federal government has no jurisdiction. And even if there is some overlapping jurisdiction, if it's truly internally involving the state's supreme. And that's dual sovereignty. Sovereignty means the power to make a decision. It's dual. Federal government has sovereignty in some areas. State governments have sovereignty in other areas. That principle was around for quite some time, but it really gets solidified during this era of the Taney court. And that's what happens in Prigg versus Pennsylvania. There that said basically the fugitive slave law could be applicable throughout every state in the union because the federal government is supreme when it comes to the federal to the fugitive slave law. But what's interesting is the federal government has no authority to make state officials actually do anything about it because that's where the state is sovereign. And so it was kind of a balancing act in the Prigg case. I might put something up on the test for the Prigg case. And that's sort of the Jackson court. It's really significant in that it's going to kowtow somewhat to states' rights, but Jackson's no state right purist, meaning if the states don't obey where the federal government has power, the states must what? The states must yield. And so he's not a true radical like John C. Calhoun would say, well, if the states don't like what the federal government is doing, we can just walk away and succeed, or we can ignore the federal mandate, and that it's not going to fly. And then the slavery issue starts coming up. Why does it come up? Well, the North pretty much ends slavery because it's not an economically viable proposition really in the Northeast. The South is reveling in slavery. It's the economic engine to the agrarian society that is the South, and so it's going to be protected in the South. It's going to become more brutalized in the South because the South is worried about losing that institution. They don't want to see freed African Americans in their community giving slaves any ideas, if you will. They don't want slaves educated. They want to suppress more than they ever have been in terms of any concept of independence. And because they're arguing things that are inconsistent with freedom and egalitarianism under the Jacksonian democracy that we were having, the only way they could justify it is through racism. That the egalitarian, fair, civic participation of all only applied to whites because African Americans weren't really human beings in the same sense. And so racism really had to be the bolstering tool to keep slavery as an institution inconsistent with these what we consider American values. And it's really sad. And not everyone in the North was, an abolitionist in the sense that they wanted to end slavery because of the humanitarian belief that all people are created equal. Sometimes they wanted to end it because it was simply, they saw it as immoral, but they didn't want to necessarily give African Americans citizenship and equal rights and participation in society because the freed blacks in the Northeast were often denied the ability to sit on juries, to vote, to own property, to sue. So there were many rights still very much limited to freed African Americans in the Northeast or in other free areas. So what's going to happen with the tension, and I don't want to make this video way too long, but what happens is we're going to get new territory. We know there's going to be Texas is basically Mexico's land, right? But the Mexican government's inviting new farmers to come into the area. It's great. You can farm here in Mexico, which is Texas. And Mexico had banned slavery quite some time ago, but the southern farmers that were coming in were bringing their slaves. Mexico didn't really do much about it other than say, it's illegal here. There is no slavery. You can't do that. But they didn't really enforce it. And then once there was enough Americans in the Texas territory, they created a rebellion, and Texas basically becomes free of Mexican control, and they petition to become part of the U.S. territory. And this creates a huge tension because the fight, and this is part of their slogan, keep Texas free for slavery. Have you ever heard a greater oxymoron in history? Keep Texas free for slavery. And the North didn't want Texas to come in as a slave state or a slave territory because they thought it would make the southern states and the southern ideology more powerful in the federal government if it was allowed in as a slave state. So the first provision I want you to know about is the Wilmot Proviso, and this is basically as a result of the end of that war, that battle. The Congressman Wilmot said, "Yeah, we'll help you. We'll finance it. We'll bring Texas in as a territory and later as a state, provided it's free," meaning that there's no slavery allowed. This outraged the South. They thought, you're chipping away at states' rights. You're chipping away at our freedom. You're chipping away at our property interests because slaves are property. That's their view. And so the tensions are really, really starting to rise. And we know they can't, because of the frustrations between North and South, North largely not wanting to expand slavery, not necessarily wanting to end it entirely. Some did, but some were just more about keeping it where it currently was and not allowing expanding into new territories. For 10 years, Texas is the Republic of Texas. It's its own country. A lot of people don't know that it successfully broke away from the Mexican government. It became its own independent nation. It tried to join the United States, but the United States government, because of gridlock between mostly northern and southern views over slavery, it took over 10 years before the Republic of Texas came in as part of an American territory. Really interesting. I think it's interesting. So this tension is going back and forth. Some people say slavery is inherently in violation of the Constitution. Others say the Constitution actually protects the institution of slavery. And the debates go on, and the tensions get higher and higher. And there are other territories that are going to become settled. And we know there's a compromise in 1819, sometimes called the Missouri Compromise. And it's basically going to say above a certain property, latitude, slavery is going to be banned, and below that, slavery will be allowed. And then later, there's a compromise in 1850. The 1850 compromise is somewhat similar. And that's basically going to let Missouri in as a slave state, but let Maine in as a free state, and that's going to balance things out. Well, that was actually the compromise of 1819, but the compromise of 1850 is again this sort of compromise between keeping certain areas free of slavery and allowing others to become slave states. Then that gets undone. I mean, I'm rushing through this. Obviously, I just made a huge faux pas between the 1819 compromise and the compromise of 1850. But then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this is the concept called popular sovereignty. Let's let the territories determine whether it's slave or free. Let's the people decide. That's a states' rights view, and it created a huge problem because people would literally. People that are abolitionists would run to the territory. People that were slave owners would run to the territory. And so they could try to make the case that the state should either be a slave state or a free state. And the tensions are just boiling over. It becomes huge. It's palpable. We know we're on the eve of a revolution. And what really changes things in terms of the view is a surprise. I think it's a surprise ruling. Is the Dred Scott decision? And this is constitutional history. What does the Constitution mean in these circumstances? Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act seems to solve that. That's going to be popular sovereignty now in these new territories. Basically, whatever the people want is going to rule the day. Very controversial. Many in the South hate it. Many in the North hate it because it's just like one of those things. Like people say, no, I want slavery protected no matter where it goes. I'm a slave owner. I should be able to take my property wherever I want to go and use that institution because I'm a free. The freedom entails ownership of property. My property interest should be protected. In the North, saying slavery is an abomination. It's inconsistent with our values, and it shouldn't spread anywhere more than it is. In fact, eventually it should be, ended in other areas of the country. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going on. Then we have this case, I think it's 1857, Dred Scott. This guy is an African-American slave. He is brought to a free territory for a period of time. And there's an argument based upon other case law, mostly out of England, Somerset case, that once somebody is in a free area, you become emancipated. You're free. You can't be put back into an institution of slavery. And so Dred Scott sues, and it ends up going to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court makes two rulings that to this day live in infamy. This is mostly what the test is going to be about from this section of the chapter. It rules not only is Dred Scott not a citizen and therefore doesn't have standing. In order to sue in court, you usually have to have standing. Whether you're a corporation or individual, you have to have the power to sue. And they said, you're not even really a human being. You're not a citizen. You're an inferior race. You don't have the power to bring an action. Well, that's bad enough, and that could have ended the case right there, and then we would have lived with maybe the Kansas-Nebraska Act for a period of time and see how things unfolded, where California would be free and some of these other states would be based upon popular sovereignty. What are we going to do is we're going to take Dred Scott case one step further and not only say you're not a person for purposes of standing, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, the Compromise of 1819, so-called Missouri, all of them are unconstitutional because slavery is recognized as a property interest. Slaves are property, just like my cup of coffee, my eyeglasses, that weird-looking lamp, my button collection. It's all my property. And like any other property, what am I free to do under the Privileges and Immunity Clause of our Constitution, called the Comity Clause? I'm free to go to any state in the union with my property, and the federal government will make sure that my vested property interests are protected, which would include my slaves. So therefore, I'm free to go to these other communities and take my slaves with me. And the federal government, nor arguably a state government, there's a big argument about that, but definitely the federal government can't legislate that and say you can't take your property there. Whether a state bans slavery is arguably still up to the states, is one of the arguments that's going on. And Lincoln and Douglas, when they run for the president, argue over whether states still have the power to ban slavery. The Dred Scott decision is not quite clear. I would argue that the Dred Scott decision basically says, no, it's property. You can go anywhere. You can go up to Maine with your slaves. You can go to Massachusetts with your slaves if you want. You can go to New California, even though California banned it. And there's another tension that's completely not appropriate for this conversation. But you need to know the Dred Scott decision upended the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and in fact, it upended many of the Southern slave owners' desire. All the Southern slave owners want to do is be able to take slaves into the area that was under the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850, and be able to bring their slaves to those regions that we agreed would be able to be slave states. This went further. This went along with what we call the firebranders of the South, that slavery should be opened up to the entire nation. The federal government should have any say in it at all. And that's exactly what Dred Scott did. It shocked our nation. It even shocked Southern slave owners. It went further than what they really expected. And we knew the Republicans were coming into power. It's a new party. Really shocking, almost in that next election, they almost pulled it off, but they're going to win in 1860 because the Democrats, the Northern Democrats, are more anti-slavery. The Southern Democrats are more pro-slavery. It splits the party. The Northern Democrats nominate Stephen A. Douglas, actually not the worst guy in the world, even though at the time he's viewed as being having an allegiance to the slave states. He actually had an allegiance to the national government. In fact, after he loses, all he does is advocate about rallying around the flag. We got to save the Union. Really bright guy. He actually beat Lincoln in a previous state race. But anyways, he gets nominated by the Democratic Party of the North. The South doesn't trust the Northern Democrats, so they nominate this guy named Breckinridge. The party split. And when you split any party, what usually happens, you got two nominees. How do you have two nominees? They go, the party that might not win, but because they're unified, are going to pull it off, and that's the Republican Party, and they endorse Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln is not an abolitionist by any means. All he wants, he's a free soiler. What's a free soiler? He wants our Western expansion into these new territories to be absent of slavery. He had no qualms at that juncture about slavery in the southern states that already had it as an institution. He wasn't threatening them in any way, shape, or form. But the South saw the Republican nomination for presidency, Lincoln becoming president, as going to shape the judiciary in the future. Members of the Supreme Court will now be allied with Republican views, which were mostly anti-slavery, that the federal government would do everything to basically weaken and undermine the slavery institution. And so they saw it. That's it. That's the breaking point. And so they succeed. And they succeed before Lincoln even gets sworn in as president. And Buchanan is the president of the United States. And what's Buchanan do? I like the quote in one of the books I read about the Civil War. He suffered from paralysis of deciding to do anything because there was no bullets fired initially. There was no conflict. They basically it was South Carolina first, six states, I think, in total, Florida, Alabama, Missouri, Mississippi. They joined South Carolina, Georgia. They joined the Deep South, basically decides to succeed. No shots are fired. They basically they take over some of the post offices, some of the federal offices. Many of the people that were basically in those positions basically stayed in their positions, but they're no longer working for the federal government. They're now working for their respective states, and they create what's called the Confederacy. States are sovereign. They are a club or an affiliation of friendship for certain purposes, but for the most part, the states rule themselves, and that's basically what we had in the Articles of Confederation. That's why it's called the Confederation. No shots are fired. Nothing's really going on. Lincoln, in his inauguration address, doesn't talk about violence, but talks about, a house divided can't stand. We are a union of people. We are not a union of states. We have been this way since the Declaration of Independence, even before the Constitution was created. He argued we were one nation, and you can't divide one nation, and the succession has to stop. But he says he's not going to be the violent. We're not going to do anything violent, and we're going to wait for the South either to come to some kind of compromise. And there was a lot of hope for compromise during these intervening months. But we know what happens eventually. There's a military outpost in South Carolina called Fort Sumner, and eventually they're going to try to take it over with military action, and that's when the Civil War, in terms of military conflict, breaks out. So who wins? States' rights, federal supremacy. It doesn't get this resolved politically. It doesn't even get resolved by the courts. How does it get resolved? By the Civil War. The Civil War is going to basically end the argument once and for all. The federal government supreme John Marshall's view of federal supremacy and a wide degree of power. Like, for example, Andrew Jackson vetoed a law to make a road into Kentucky because he says it's only in Kentucky. It doesn't impact interstate commerce. But the road was eventually going to lead to the Mississippi River. It's going to have all kinds of impact on commerce in other states. And Andrew Jackson, no, that's not what the Commerce Clause means. But we know after the Civil War, the national view is pronounced. States are going to have a very diminished role in the realm of public welfare within its eternal confines, and it's going to be very, very narrow. And the Civil War is what ends it. I'm going to put up a brief video, probably not today, but we have to talk about the amendments to the Constitution as a result of that. Now, why don't I put them on right now? Let's just talk about this. What happens at the end of the Civil War is that slavery is going to, it gets bigger during the 4-year period of the war, 4 or 5 years of the Civil War. We know it's going to basically be a war over ending slavery. A lot of people think Lincoln ends slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not entirely true. He basically declares as a measure of the war that those territories, those states that are in rebellion, he's freeing all the African Americans as an asset to the war effort. The Emancipation Proclamation is only a temporary. It's only while they're in rebellion. Are there some slave states that aren't in rebellion? Yes. They've either been subdued or they never revolted, and the slavery was alive and well there, and it was allowed to stay. But there comes a recognition that Lincoln he views it, and the other Republicans view it, especially they're called radical Republicans. They want to put an end to slavery once and for all, everywhere in the nation. Lincoln recognizes on the eve of the Civil War ending that prior to the South coming into the full status of voting rights in the process of amending the Constitution, needed to do while they were in a non-participatory stage, and that was the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And this basically ended slavery, except for those that are incarcerated. Some people argue, well, there's so many people incarcerated, many more African Americans per capita than whites. That's the new form of slavery, and that's an argument. But in terms of indentured servitude of any time, it's going to be banned by the 13th Amendment. You can't be in indentured servitude, even by agreement. You can have I'll work for you for 7 years for peanuts as long as you teach me trade. No, that's why we have the right to quit a job at any moment we want. You can be sued for damages, but you can't be forced to work for anybody else unless you're incarcerated after a duly given sentence. And the next, because we freed African Americans, slavery really did still exist, because just because you're free doesn't mean you get to participate in civic life. You might not even be able to contract. You might not be able to own property. You might not be able to vote. All these terrible, it's almost worse in some ways just early on in the post-Civil War era for African Americans not having true civil liberties, if you will. And there's a recognition of that. So in 1868, they passed the 14th Amendment, which is the most powerful amendment to the United States Constitution. It's going to eventually make all of the Bill of Rights applicable to the states. Remember, I just told you, under Barron v. Baltimore, the Supreme Court said that the amendments don't apply to state action. Now they do. Or they will through a series of cases called incorporation. The Bill of Rights will be applicable to the states. But the 14th Amendment says no state can basically deprive its citizens of equal protection of the law and due process of law. And many people thought that would now give African American males at least the power to vote, participate in civic life, to own property, to sit on juries and do all those things. But the power to vote was still really denied most African Americans in southern states. We know the rise of the Ku Klux Klan comes up, and they had to pass these things called the enforcement laws, and we had the Freeman Bureau down south in order to make African Americans be somewhat safe in light of the retaliation against them from the Civil War. It wasn't enough. They needed the 15th Amendment. So when I talk about the civil rights amendments, the 13th Amendment ends slavery, the 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and equal treatment under the law is the argument, and the state can't deprive us of those. It really expands federal government big time. Civil War, that's where it's embodied in law, giving the federal government all this power to interfere into internal state mechanisms to ensure equality of treatment and fundamental rights not being denied to its citizens. But then the 15th Amendment, no state can discriminate for voting based upon race or color or creed. You still can do it if you're a woman or a Native American. Native Americans don't get the power until much later. So one of the groups fighting for this were actually women, and women really get shortchanged for a long period of time. It takes until 1920, 1919 for nationwide suffrage movement to get approved. But it was women who often fought for the ending of slavery and the emancipation of African American, now Americans. Now they're going to be deemed citizens, by the way, because you can't have rights unless you're a citizen. So those amendments did that, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 15th Amendment giving black males the power to vote. And we know there's a renaissance period for African Americans just after the Civil War, because the South is going to be dominated by federal troops and the Freeman Borough. And South Carolina, for example, had several African American men serve in the House of Representatives for a period of time because there were more African Americans in South Carolina than whites, or a very close margin between the two. So they were able to run for office and be successful. They were able to open businesses, sit in city councilors all throughout the South for a period of time. And that's the period of Reconstruction. And a lot of people think Reconstruction is a really negative period, but it's actually a pretty decent period for recently freed African Americans. And then what's the backlash? Well, there's a compromise of 1877. There's a presidential race, and we can't figure out if it's Samuel Tilden that won it. He's the Democrat, or whether or not the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes won. And they make this compromise. The South says you can have your Republican president, but you got to end Reconstruction, take all the Southern troops out, and let the states run themselves again. And that terrible compromise, I don't know if the compromise is so terrible, but the result is terrible, because the Southern states basically did all kinds of things, Jim Crow laws and other poll taxes and things like that, to basically disenfranchise African Americans. And they're out of office, they're out of political participation again, and they're threatened at the polls, and they participate very little, not because they don't want to, it's they're basically barred from doing so through violence. Sad part of our history, but we're going in the right direction, at least in terms of law. And I'll leave you with that, and I'll put up an assignment related to mostly Dred Scott. Otherwise, be well.